So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. And to give you some context, I'm going to take John's lead here and introduce the team first. I'm speaking here on behalf of FRI Research, and I look after the Healthy Landscapes team, and this is the team. So most of the forest management companies between the Ontario border and the Rocky Mountains and governments and up into the Northwest Territories. And our sort of loose mandate here is a group interested in exploring the concepts of ecosystem-based concepts using our understanding of natural patterns. So what does that mean? Everyone has a different definition of ecosystem-based approaches, and those of you who have read anything about this realize that it's infinite. So I'll give you a different version here. We manage, and we heard a little bit about this today, we manage the forest and the forest ecosystem right now in pieces. Okay? It's just the way we deal with complex systems. We break them down into pieces so we can understand them and we can study them. And that's been our approach for management. That's our approach for scientists. That's how I was trained. That's when you get a PhD, you become an expert in this, right? Not this. We break it down into pieces, and here's some examples. So over here we've got, for example, maybe a national park, right? And over here maybe a community that wants to be fire smarted. And here's a provincial park here, and here's an FMA. And let's not kid ourselves about FMAs. The reason that's all chopped up is that forest management tenure is not for the whole landscape, right? It's for the upland portion. So there's all these other bits and pieces here that fall between the cracks, literally. And we do the same thing with species, right? Here's a moose, here's a shark, there's some bears. We manage those pieces as well. And then, of course, the unique Alberta situation is that we have one piece of land with multiple tenures for different natural resources on the same piece of ground. So we manage in pieces on all kinds of different levels. And then we're told to put it all together. So we've got this beautiful, wonderful natural system. We take it apart. We give individual pieces to different management, different regulatory agencies. Some are federal, some are provincial, some are municipal, some are local. They come up with their own set of rules. They don't necessarily have to even talk to each other about them, best management practices, and now we're told to put it all back together. That's how we get cumulative effects. And I'm sorry, I know I wasn't supposed to talk about that, but that's an issue, right? So from a healthy landscapes perspective, our thought is, what if we don't take the world apart in the first place? Let's take a look at the whole ecosystem. Not the pieces. There's lots of good work doing that. You've heard all about that today. Let's focus on the system. Now the system itself becomes a value. Okay? That's something that I don't think we value. What we're talking about here are pieces of the system, not the system itself. So if we do that, and here's a really, really simple version of how the boreal forest works. Okay? We start at the top with climate, which drives disturbance patterns, which create landscape conditions, and those are things like age class distributions, the amount of different cereal stages, patch size distributions, sort of value neutral things. And out of that come consequences, and those would be things that would be related more to our values, like habitat for different species, and then right at the very bottom, we've got our values. So yes, I agree, there's lots of feedback loops in here. This is very simplistic, but in general, this is what we're dealing with. Now think about how we manage it. We manage it by try to manage these things to go up. Okay? So what if we turned that model around? Said, let's use how the system works. So essentially, if we understand this system of how the boreal works, we can manage anything. Okay? The whole climate change argument that the past isn't modeler for a future, that goes away. Because now we understand the relationship between disturbance, conditions, values, and climate. Okay? This is what we're after. Okay? And there's a lot of EBM advocates out there that would say that's the point. Okay? Not emulating natural patterns or disturbance, understanding that diagram. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how this might play out. So the first thing we have to do is understand what system that we have. Okay? and then agree on a desired future, and we can do that collaboratively together, and then we take a look at the tools. So we've already seen a couple of pictures of this out there. Let's take this as example number one. We've got a landscape in which cumulative effects have been happening. There's harvesting, there's seismic lines, there's well sites. Is this a landscape that we think would be healthy? Probably not. We could agree on that. So what would we change? Based on what we understand, and there's a whole bunch of background research I'm not going to give you the details for. I don't know whether to apologize or not for that, but I can give them to you later. The disturbance is not the problem per se on this landscape, okay? Disturbance is a good thing, okay? The boreal forest depends on disturbance. And if we take a look at the amount of disturbance on this particular landscape that we're seeing right here, it's in the 5 to 6% range. Given the fire return interval on average on this landscape, which is about 100 years, that's actually on the low end, right? The amount of disturbance on this landscape is not the problem. It's how it's arranged in space, the severity, the shape, and the size, and the spacing. Our management of disturbance is the problem, okay? So how can we change what we understand, given with what we understand about how this system works, how would we want to change it? We probably would like to have fewer linear features because they're not particularly natural. We probably don't want to be everywhere all the time, and this is a very common theme because now we have no large patches. That big map that was shown of the 500-meter buffering for caribou habitat is a good example of that. We're everywhere all the time. It's not the total amount of disturbance, it's the fact that we're everywhere. So we probably want to cluster a bit more. We probably want to leave some areas alone, and we want to do some, and we want to at least reduce our linear feature footprint. First things first, disturbance is a good thing. Okay, we have to accept that. A freshly disturbed site, okay, has a huge spike in biodiversity. I used to fight fires in Ontario, and walking through them, you would have, as the fire was still smoking, there would be green things coming up. If you stopped and listened, you could hear the bark beetles. You could hear them, they were so loud. There were so many of them. So I with all due respect to to John's comment about 30 years later, I think 1 year after a fire, biodiversity peaks. And in some cases, I would bet it's higher than old growth forest. We pay so much attention to things like old growth forest, we don't pay anything, has anyone heard the term young growth, right? It's just as important to the boreal ecosystem, okay? And another thing I want to point out is that those curves that John and Ellen showed, when it has that term recovery on it, it's not a competition, right? It doesn't mean one's good and one's bad. It means the benchmark is the pre-disturbed site, okay? It's just a different ecosystem. And the boreal forest needs different ecosystems. And young forest is just different. It's no better, it's no worse. So, disturbance is good. They should be planned collaboratively, and we have lots of tools that are available. And I'm going to introduce a term here that I'm going to call a disturbance plan. So, in this particular example, we're going to use 3 of those. Here we're going to use harvesting, restoration, and avoidance. And I'll show you how. So we've got this landscape, and we're going to try to move it, for lack of a better term, closer to what Mother Nature would have done, a healthier state, something that we could probably all agree is a good thing to do. First thing we're going to use is we're going to divide it up into areas that I call wheres and whens. The wheres are where activity is going to occur, and in those, we're going to use harvesting to erase the existing footprint that's completely unnatural, restore linear features that are underneath it, and sort of wipe the slate clean, okay? The whens are going to be areas that we're going to have temporal deferrals. We're going to all agree to stay out of there for a set number of years, not permanently, okay? These things rotate around the landscape, 10, 20 years, whatever that number is. We're also going to use strategic restoration of linear features in the whens. Okay? So we're using avoidance, those are the whens. We're using restoration for linear features, and harvesting to obliterate the footprint, and to create that all-important young forest. In terms of the wheres, and I swear, John, I made this slide before you sent out the retention guidelines. I didn't know they were coming. So everyone has a different term for it, right? Retention forestry, new age forestry, whatever it's called, but everyone has a different word for it. We're actually pretty good at that right now. There's lots of good examples. This picture here is from actually the Mistahay in Saskatchewan, which is the oldest one I know of. And we flew some so-called experts around two summers ago, and they didn't know it was a harvest block. So we're pretty good at that stuff. What we don't have maybe so much experience with is the degree to which harvesting can erase that linear feature footprint underneath, right? Potentially, it sounds like a great idea. I don't know if there's a whole lot of experience there. The winds we've got a little bit less experience with. We are, thanks to people like Tim Vinge and others, doing some good work on the restoration of linear features to get them back on a natural vegetation trajectory. I didn't have a good picture for avoidance, so I threw the moose up here, but that's a big one, right? Avoidance, the agreement to not go into an area collectively for a certain amount of time. That's a pretty big one, but it's a tool at our disposal. So we applied this to actually an area just south of Fort McMurray. We went big, 330,000 hectares. This was just a modeling exercise, and we picked out some wheres and wins. The wins are in red there, and the greens are the wheres. That proportion is based on calculation of historical precedent from fire patterns. Okay, and here are the results. Now, so what I want you to focus on is this one here. Okay, this is the comparison of no restoration, just the amount of disturbance edge in the landscape, 516 kilometers. NRV, and just straight NRV guidelines out of Quebec, Ontario, BC Biodiversity guidelines, any of those sorts of things would have just, here's what you do forestry. So improved it, but our toolkit improved it significantly more. Far less edge on that landscape. Forestry was restoring that landscape. Take a look at the area of large old forest patches. It almost tripled, right? Went from 12,000 up to almost 30,000 hectares within the first 20 years. With that combination of toolkit and the hectaration of linear features, and remember, this is the same amount of wood that's coming out, exact same amount of dollar investment in terms of restoration, and we got much more bang for a buck in doing that, okay? In some cases here, it's really interesting, check this out, the NRV in these cases didn't improve that much more, and that's because, and somebody's already mentioned this, they couldn't find the wood, right? The landscape was already so chopped up, and there's so much non-forested area there that it couldn't find those big events. So this combination of using forestry in combination with others did the trick. Okay, example number 2. This is another landscape. This is in the foothills, okay? Understand this system, pick a desired future, identify the tools. It's a trick question. This is classic foothills, beautiful, almost pure pine, dense, old. What could be wrong with it, right? Well, wildfires do this, and that's what we tend to think of them, but Colin actually did a really nice job of setting me up here. They also do this, okay? And a mixed fire regime means it does both on the same landscapes at different times. That beautiful area that you saw, and you walk through it and you think, great, even-aged forest, not true. The average return interval there is between 30 and 50 years. Okay, we've only just started to do this. This is all published research for anyone who wants to take a look at it now. Really nice work out there. We're going to expand this work, but we have fires that are, and there's one for someone who wants to check it. That's actually Highway 22 down here and the cadet areas down here. If that makes any sense. It's 5,000 hectares. 5% of it burned entirely. The rest of it is partially burned. Less severe more often. What does that mean? We have an entirely different regime on that landscape potentially now, right? The natural disturbance threat, as everyone knows who lives close to there, is through the roof. It's unprecedented. Mountain pine beetle threat is high. The diversity at both the stand and the landscape level has reached a new low. There's entire habitat types that don't exist on that landscape anymore. right? Maybe they're important for caribou. We don't know because they don't exist. Resilience has gone way down. So in terms of climate change, we have a very low diverse system there. It's beautiful, but there's not much diversity. There's actually a quick diagram of showing some of the NRV work we've done in green and the current condition for mountain pine beetle threat. Not a big surprise. We're way out of NRV existing landscape. What future do you want for this landscape? You can have the beautiful landscape, right? There's no right answer to this, and as a scientist, I'm not going to tell you that. You can have that landscape, but you have to accept that it is very different than that was there historically, and it's not going to support the species assemblage that were there, perhaps including caribou, right? It's going to be less diverse. It's going to be less resilient. It's going to have high fire risk, and risk to all natural disturbances. So that's a choice that you have to make. And then in terms of the tools to get there, it's hard to imagine getting there if there's any desire to restore this landscape and start to reverse this trend without doing it without forest harvesting. Okay, unless you're prepared to move everybody out of the foothills and let Mother Nature take its course with fires, and they're probably at this point all going to be high severity anyways, the only way you're going to do it is with a toolkit. It's going to involve managed fire. It's going to involve prescribed fire, but it's sure going to have to involve some mechanical activities. You need forestry to be able to manage this. So, second last slide. Yes, I was supposed to talk about forest management and residuals and EBM, but we have to stop creating puzzle pieces, okay? And every time we create a new set of rules that has only to do with one piece, and we don't start talking to each other, we've created another puzzle piece, okay? Once you start to put the pieces together, right, we can do some good things, and no one's going to walk away from these landscapes and stop and allow forest fires to burn. So given the importance of disturbance and keeping that landscape resilient, mechanical activities is one part of that toolkit. That's not to say that we shouldn't have other things in the toolkit. We absolutely should, but we should be using them in a smart way. Call it smart harvesting.